85% of adults say they regularly experience stress, with half recognising that they are too stressed. We need to talk about anxiety. This autumn, we'll be looking at some of the different forms of anxiety and the issues that can be on our minds. Jesus had a lot to say about our mental well-being, and we believe his gospel is the very best solution to dealing with anxiety.
And I was just like, but I don't care. And I grabbed every pill. I was like, don't know what that is. Take that. And fortunately for me, there was nothing majorly, but I emptied everything, floating in the clouds. I didn't know what was going on, but thankfully I didn't kill myself. But I didn't care at that moment. I was like, I don't care. I've just had enough. And it was, I just basically reached a point where it's like, I've just can't take it no more. I became a Christian 2 years after that. That was wonderful. And so I had this incredible joy, and I knew like I was loved and forgiven. But I quickly found out, I stopped cussing. I walked out of church, stopped cussing, and I stopped the drugs, literally. That was it. And so I was like, wow, I am truly born again. I am a Christian. But then I shortly afterwards found out, like, I've still got this stuff going on inside, and it hasn't departed just because I became a Christian.
Hi everybody, so good to be talking to you. If you're new here, my name's Joel, and I'm talking to you from the Bible about this huge subject of anxiety that we have been talking about from different angles through the autumn term. We're specifically addressing the theme of suicide today, as you will have learned from that preceding video featuring Meryl's story. The Bible has a lot to say, actually, relating to this subject, which is a growing subject or a growing concern in our society. Last year, the figures for suicide went up in the UK by 12%. The demographic which is most acutely affected is those who are men in their late 40s. And yet, it's alarming that in the under 25s generation, amongst young people, there was a leap of 23.7% in 2018 on the year before. So we are talking about something of genuine concern. The trends are alarming, and we might be likely to ask the question of why is this happening? Where is this development coming from? A few generations ago, in fact, back in 1897, the man who's sometimes considered the father of sociology, Émile Durkheim, the French sociologist, he published a book called Suicide, where he noted the fact that it was amongst the most affluent countries in Western Europe, the most wealthy, the most apparently stable, that the suicide rates were peaking. And he began to investigate this and came to some conclusions that I think are still very relevant today. His point was that whereas in previous generations, when societies had not developed such sophisticated systems of industry and sophisticated economies, people were still very much identified with and connected to family, tradition, nationhood, and tended to get their sense of worth and meaning and identity from those things. And that with those things effectively eroded in a post-industrial society where people were being swept into a kind of big urban swirl of individuals, individual units, individual consumers who are kind of expected to almost kind of compete as individuals in a new, massive, broad realm where you are not valid by virtue of connecting with a family. You're not given your worth by that, by your background and family, by your position in a smaller community that's got tradition and roots. You're valid if you perform well. You're valid if you make the grade, if you succeed, if you make the right decisions out of a range of multiple decisions that you wouldn't, in previous generations, have had to face. You wouldn't have had to even consider them. But now, in a world where there are so many choices, so many freedoms, so many consumer decisions to make, It can, in fact, be bewildering and exasperating just to have to do that, but then to have to know that you've got this constant sense of evaluation going on. Have I made it? Have I succeeded? Am I enough? And he said that in a world like that, it's perhaps not necessarily surprising that suicide rates seem to go rogue. They seem to go out of expectation, even in the most apparently wealthy societies. And I wonder if generations later we're seeing that trend multiplied in a culture where even family, generations later, such as it has become, has been even more broken down, more disintegrated. People are supposed to be cared for in cultures like the UK, in cities like Brighton and Hove and beyond. We build the whole culture around individual fulfillment, don't we? We care about your consumer needs, and we make sure that you get a chance to get exactly the service that you want, and we want you to give a 5-star review on our service. And so we make sure that you as an individual, you the consumer, get what you want. And there's never been a society perhaps like ours where people individually are expected to get what they want, and yet at the same time, perhaps there's never been such a society where people have felt so lost and so without meaning and purpose in life. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that one of the effects of that is this rate goes up. So we're going to look at how the Bible deals with this, and there are several places we could go to in the Bible, and we'll go to a few of them. But I want to start by just reading from one of Paul's letters, 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul, in the early church, went through a lot of struggles and sufferings for the sake of being a disciple of Jesus, and he expresses it sometimes with genuine emotion. He's very happy to share his actual feelings with us. And he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 to 10, these following words. So let's follow these as they come up on the screen.
2 Corinthians 1, verses 8 to 10. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him, we have set our hope that he will deliver us again.
A friend of mine a few weeks ago was telling me about a time in his story, in his past, where another friend of his had attempted suicide. A dear friend of his who he was very close to, and it put a huge wedge between them. It caused a real strain on their relationship. This man attempted unsuccessfully to kill himself. My friend found it extremely hard to forgive him. He actually felt he couldn't talk to him, he couldn't face him, he couldn't get past what had happened. It actually only changed when his wife began to encourage him to think differently and look at the problem the right way round. But it struck me as another interesting example of how suicide, even in our day and age when we are, I think, increasingly encouraged and expected to express deep compassion towards people who struggle with suicidal thoughts and feelings and tendencies. And even at a time as well, like our age, when the idea of mortal sins, the idea of suicide being a sin, I suppose that in the broader society we might treat that idea as just sort of strange and archaic and not particularly relevant. But nevertheless, we find suicide particularly a dark and painful thing to come to terms with. We do struggle. We do find relationships are profoundly hurt by it. And it's worth considering, why might that be? I wonder if the clue is actually in the name. The word suicide literally means to cut oneself off. To cut oneself off. It's a case of cutting myself off from everybody. And if That means cutting myself off even from the people who would have most trusted me, who I would have been most close to. I suppose it could be seen as the ultimate act of betrayal and rejection. So people who are left behind often will struggle with this feeling as much as any. Why didn't they talk to me? Why didn't they come to me? Why did they reject me? Why did they behave so independently? I feel rejected in this whole horrifying experience. And to be sure, it's worth thinking how that might be traced onto a relationship to God. If it's an act of betrayal towards our closest ones, then maybe it is towards Him as well. And that certainly is the understanding that the church and the scriptures would have given over hundreds of years, that suicide is no small thing. It is the taking of a life, and when you take a human life, you deal with somebody who carries the image of God. This is no small thing to do. It's not to be played around with. And in the Bible, it would be certainly understood that way. Having said that, it's important and interesting to see how those few cases of actual suicide that we come across in the Bible are often understood in a remarkably compassionate and tragic kind of way. We see personalities in the pages. We see 3D characters. We don't see cartoons. We don't see flimsy, just kind of comical villains. We see people who have genuine sorrows and pains and griefs, and we see what drives them. We see what makes them tick. And we see people like King Saul, who's one of the most tragic characters, I think, in all of literature, let alone in just the Bible. He causes us to grieve when we look at what point he came to, and finally that's how his life ends. He takes his life, or at least he asks a soldier to kill him. Another character a few pages later, Ahithophel. You see the guy who, such a noble and wise man, but brought terrible destruction on his own life by making a dreadful decision to follow a traitor, and ends up himself reaping a terrible reward and decides to take his own life. There's other people who don't take their own lives, but they express suicidal feelings. They express suicidal instincts in the way they talk, often in the way they pray. We may not even expect this. It perhaps surprises us to think of it this way, but some of the most heroic characters in this whole book are brought to that very point of begging God to take their life from them and wishing that God had never given them life, and being so desperate, so loathing of their lives and of themselves that they are brought to a place of longing to end it all, just longing for their life to be taken. Job prays that way on really more than one occasion out of a desperate season of suffering in his life. Jeremiah, another famously deeply emotional book and deeply emotional man, expresses suicidal thoughts. There's no other way of saying it. The man gets suicidal in a few places in the I think extraordinary book of Jeremiah. Elijah, maybe one of my favorite characters in the whole Bible, a bit of a hero. I mean, he is a hero. He's a phenomenal hero. He's one of those extraordinary Bible characters that does seem extraordinary until you see he's ordinary. And the Bible has a way of quite potently making that point. That even Elijah, terribly ordinary, terribly weak, brought to a terrible place of despair, disappointment with self, terrible, dreadful disillusionment. I'm no better than my fathers, he says. It is enough. Take my life from me. When he sees himself acting in a straight line of decision making, which seems to reflect fear and cowardice and exhaustion and emotional exhaustion, he runs away, hides away in every sense, tries to hide from God. tries to hide from everything he can, and God finds him out. God sort of chases him into the desert, chases him into the wilderness, and Elijah's words are, "It is enough, take my life from me. I don't want to know, I don't want to talk to you, I can't do this anymore. I just can't, I can't face another day." Elijah, one of our heroes, brought to such a place of self-loathing, of suicide. The Bible is a beautifully honest book. It understands human experience. It pushes our face into it in all its different dimensions and facets. And we should be very grateful that this book does such a good job of helping us to see. And the reality is that suicide presents itself to us in ways that can at least seem reasonable. Times in our lives can be so bleak that suicide seems persuasive for some. You wouldn't think so, because the kind of overwhelming human instinct is for survival. That's the thing that seems to be most pressing. We want to live. We love life. We don't want to die. We don't want to bring it on ourselves ordinarily. Maybe you've seen the film 127 Hours, which is based on a true story of a man who took off one of his own limbs in order to survive. That's the human drive. There you have it. I must live. I don't want to lightly fall into death, into nothingness. So it's even more telling, perhaps, that people with that human instinct for survival can be brought to a place of deciding there's something better than survival. There's something worse than death, and that is to carry on living this non-life. Problem is, we don't even know. We won't know. We can't know, surely. That's the problem the suicidal has to face. What do I expect to happen? What can I expect? And this is Hamlet's line, that conscience doth make cowards of us all. What can I expect if I take my life, as he has to deal with in the famous story? He doesn't know what to expect next. And yet the French philosopher Pascal, he said that really the fact that people still commit suicide suggests that the promise or the hope of relief, the hope of escape, limited though it might be, risk though it might be, it's still enough. The promise of the potential for escape is still better for the suicidal than the existence that they think they're being forced to endure otherwise. So people choose it really out of a false appeal. Suicide comes to the individual as what you could call a false gospel. And by that I mean, what does the word gospel mean in the Bible? It means good news. A false good news, a false appeal of freedom, a false appeal of escape and relief and rest is offered to the suicidal. If I take my life, it's my best hope, it's my best chance. There's like an advertising campaign that goes on in the soul, and it's preaching a message, it's trying to persuade, it's trying to win us over to a way of escaping, a way of thinking that seems perhaps kind of sweet on some level. Maybe not sweet, maybe that's an unhelpful way of putting it. I guess what I mean is it's still preferable. It's still preferable to what I'm having to face. It's got to be better. And so there's a route, there's an escape. And suicide says to us, come, I'll help you escape. We should see what's going on. We should see the force behind this. I haven't mentioned yet the other famous suicidal in the Bible, Judas. It says in the book of John that Satan came into him. The devil entered him when he went to do the most despicable thing, perhaps, any human's ever done. Any evil act would have to be short of the betrayal of Jesus. Judas' act of betrayal surely stands out as something that the devil inspired in him. And then it says later, when he came to see what he'd done, he hanged himself. It's a very vivid and sudden and dramatic version, I think, of something that happens in a subtler form again and again with those who commit suicide or are drawn towards it, tempted towards it, because there's somebody living in the universe whom Jesus referred to. He talked about him as a liar and the father of lies. And his business is in deception, in saying, this is the way, come, this is the way to safety, this is the way to freedom, this is the way to fulfillment. And gradually, as we surrender more and more of our will, more and more of our freedom to his dominance, what we end up having left over is little more than a shell of our life. You ask the drug addict, you ask anybody who's so surrendered their will to something self-destructive that they feel they haven't a will left. Well, the suicide victim is another version of that. Judas went out and hanged himself because it seems the devil said, well, I've had what I need from you. You're expendable. I've used you up. There's someone, as far as Jesus is concerned, because Jesus talks about him a lot, and we should listen to Jesus, shouldn't we? Especially about subjects like this. Jesus is telling us that there is someone in the world whose business it is to use up human life, to use it up and throw it away, cast it away. And he will do it by deception. He will do it by being a liar and the father of lies. He has been lying from the beginning, Jesus said. And so we do well to look at his style. We do well to consider the way he does what he does, because he's been doing it from the beginning. He's good at this. He's got skilled in it. And the way he does it, primarily, it seems to me, is by a kind of deluding line of argument. He makes his lines so persuasive that we become more convinced of the lies and more suspicious of the truth. If you've ever talked to somebody who's in a state of deep depression, if you've ever tried to talk to somebody who's in a place of such profound introspection that you do worry about their life, you might know exactly what I mean, that you can be speaking to somebody things that are so patently, clearly, rationally obvious to you, but there seems to be some kind of blockage. This person's problem isn't actually with their reason necessarily, or at least their reason seems to have been hijacked. You can't reach their reason because their will has been dealt such a blow. Their will has become captive and their reason is becoming a servant to their will. Their will is saying, we won't receive another narrative. We won't receive another version of ideas here. And the lies that suicide brings to us don't want to dialogue. There's no discussion. There's just the forcing of its company upon us. You ever had that situation where a person has forced their companionship on you? Sometimes it's just a friend who's not really a friend, and you feel a little bit obliged to keep them with you. There's a certain maybe misguided sense of hospitality or loyalty in us, and we want to be friendly, and so we have people with us who actually they're not necessarily friends, and they make assumptions. But this can turn more sinister, people who force their companionship on others. And it becomes almost a dark part of someone's life. How do I deal with this person? How do I cut them out of my life? And I think that suicide works internally like that. It forces its way into our consciousness so that things that might have been unthinkable. And suicide at first normally would seem unthinkable. Maybe many of us in the room could say that there have been moments in our lives where the unthinkable has occurred to us, and we've just thought, just for a moment, maybe I should just end it. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe that's the answer. Or even just the simple, I kind of sometimes look forward to it all being over. I reckon there are many people watching this video who could say that. That's been part of the tape playing. That's been part of the inner rhetoric. This kind of flirtation with the notion of it could just be over. I remember once or twice, literally, in my life where I had those kinds of moments, such a sense of bleak despair that I genuinely thought, I just wonder if that's an option. And you walk away. I walked away. I remember one occasion walking away sobbing. I thought, I can't believe that just went through my mind. It shocked me. But the problem comes for some when it's not a shocking invasion that lasts moments, but it forces its companionship on our otherwise rational minds and becomes the normal language, the normal internal conversation. But it's not a conversation because it sort of forces, it sort of assumes that you just feel like I can't get around this. It seems inevitable. There's going to come a time when I'll end it. And it's brutal. And it's false. It comes from a liar. Jesus says, if you become my disciples, if you follow me, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. He comes to deliver us from the liar. He comes to bring life. He says even further on, or in the same gospel, actually in chapter 10, John's gospel, I've come that you might have life. He comes to bring death. He comes to kill. I've come that you might have life. He is the giver of life. So how does this work? Well, it comes to us by deception, and it's not rational. You can usually tell in reality somebody who's suicidal, or at least at the various potential stages, will struggle to hear reason. And even the advice, which could be very good advice, will seem impossible. I remember situations myself when the obvious advice to give to somebody, which would seem ordinarily like perfect common sense in the cold light of day, seems unthinkable. You want me to do that? I couldn't possibly do that. Ordinarily, they'd have thought, well, of course, that's the right thing I should do. That's the solution. That's how I should act. But no, it seems irrational. The rational seems irrational because assumptions have crept in, lies have crept in. Lies about the future. The person that's suicidal makes godlike judgments about the future. They seem to know everything about the future. It will never come good. It cannot. It is enough. I am on my own, and this will never change. You know, those are the kind of words that Elijah uses in 1 Kings chapter 19. He speaks as though certain things are certain. And the surprising thing in his case is he's so wrong. He says, it's enough, I'm finished. I'm the only one left. And God says to him, you're not the only one left. There are thousands of others. And God says to him, you have a future. You have a great past. I tell you, you have a great future. It's unthinkable for Elijah that he has a future at all, let alone a great future. But how wrong we can be. We are finite. We don't know, but we take upon ourselves godlike abilities to predict the future. How often have you predicted the future? How often have you predicted the future accurately? But the suicidal irrationally assumes that their ability to get the future perfectly right is unassailable. No, I know. The thing that needs to be broken is the deceptions, the assumptions that have no basis in truth. But they are powerful. The assumption that by taking my own life, I don't affect others. No one else will really notice. It won't affect others. Not so much, not so badly. How wrong. How wrong to not see that the hand grenade that we're pulling the pin from as we leave a shattered world behind us. The assumptions about God. The assumptions about the afterlife. It's a strange irrationality if we say, I can't turn to God in my despair and depression because God doesn't care about me. God doesn't know my problems. He doesn't know me. He doesn't care for me. He doesn't love me. I'm not even sure if he's real. So I'll kill myself. But surely the act of killing yourself is to put your life even more in the hands of the eternal God. Yeah, the afterlife will be okay. But you're saying God isn't okay. You're saying terrible things about God, that he doesn't care, that he doesn't love you, and yet you're prepared to throw your life away in the vague hope that he might provide, he might actually care for you. It doesn't work logically, but the whole thing doesn't. This is the point we're making. Even the assumption that for life to be worth living, I have to see how it can be fixed. I have to fix it. I have to know how it's fixed. I have to do the work of Atlas, holding the world up, because nothing less than that is good enough. I have to solve all the problems. Who says? Whoever said that? No, your life is best lived when you don't know all the answers. You don't know what's to come tomorrow. It's normal human life to not know what's coming tomorrow. That's not so strange. That's normal. And to turn to God in trust and say, I don't know the future. I'm terrified of the future. I'm terrified of what I have to face. There are people I can't face. There's shame I can't face. There's things I can't do. There's stuff that I've failed in. There's so much that I'm terrified of. And yet somehow you've promised that you hold the future. And so I trust you just for today. I don't know about tomorrow. I almost feel that I can't trust you for tomorrow, but I'll trust you for today. And then I'll trust you for the next day. This is all God asks of us. That's actually all he asks of us. He doesn't ask us to hold the universe up. He doesn't. He never does. He calls us to trust him for today. But we don't see that sometimes because we're deceived. And so the necessity is undeception. That's the work of the hour, right? It's being set free. It's being helped to stop and question the assumptions. Have you noticed as we've gone through this series, how much of the time that's the very thing Jesus saying in the Sermon on the Mount, consider the sparrow, consider the lily, look at the birds of the air, look at them. Why are you anxious? It takes time. Jesus insists on exercises that slow us down. Why? Because anxiety and suicide refuse to let you slow down. They get you trapped in a headlock. They get you in cycles of despair. You might think, no, I'm lazy. I haven't done any work for years. I'm unemployed. I'm resting. You're not resting. You might be resting externally. You haven't rested internally for years. And it's time to rest. It's time to stop, to cease from your labor. You know, the Bible has it from the very first page, the 7 days of creation at the end of which he rested. And he insists on it for us that there's rhythms of life where we stop, where we rest. That's what the word Sabbath means. Stop, cease. Do you cease? Suicide doesn't like that. Won't let you stop, won't let you cease. So you must. You must. Just change it. Force back. Push back. Dialogue it. Ask questions of it. Ask questions. What kind of questions? What am I expecting from this? Relief? Am I expecting to make a statement of some kind to the world around me? Am I feeling a desperate need for something? What do you think suicide will relieve you from? Is there a deep sense of need? What is it that you feel that you need? I've lost something. I can't get back. What is it? Isn't that revealing to you when you stop and consider what is driving you in this? What is the great need that you feel? What is the great thing you've lost? Perhaps that's an indication of what you have put your hope in. You hoped in something. You've hoped maybe in something you shouldn't have, and you don't have to. There is another hope. You've imagined that the pain that you feel now is eternal, that it's constant, it's never going to change, but you know it doesn't. Ask yourself, is the pain lying to me? Pain does that. Pain lies. Pain says, I'm never leaving. But you know just by stopping for a moment that pain changes, the levels change, they become more tolerable. They do. They become more tolerable. You regain your objectivity, you see things differently. So to question the pain It becomes essential. What's going on? Is the pain deceiving? Is the pain lying? That's one of its most brutal qualities. And can I be reconciled? Yes. Are there people that you can't imagine ever being brought back into fellowship, friendship, reconciliation, forgiveness with? You read this book, you see it's full of hope for it. It's full of hope for the shameful. And shame is perhaps the biggest thing involved in this. Perhaps the question we should be asking is, what is it that I'm ashamed of? What great thing am I ashamed of? What do I fear? What can I not face? There are things that are worse than that shame. And it's time for us to see things in the right proportion and actually to see you can be rescued from shame. That is the message that this book breathes out on us. The shame is perhaps at the heart of the problem for the person that's suicidal, because the shame is what stops us being able to talk and open up. That's why I went to 2 Corinthians 1 at the very start of this message. Do you remember? 2 Corinthians, where Paul, the strong Paul, the extraordinary Paul was one of the most phenomenally gifted people in the history of mankind. And he knew it too. He talks about it in one of his letters. He says, if anyone thinks they're qualified, I'm more qualified. He says it. He's that sure of it. He knew what he was good at. And so he wrote a whole letter here, one of a longer letter than the other one, saying, do you know what, in the end, I'm desperately weak. That's one of the main points of 2 Corinthians. It's Paul saying to people, by the way, living in Corinth, one of the most strutting, overconfident X-Factor cities in the world. Corinth's got talent. You come here if you dare. Make an impression, especially if you're a religious teacher. If you're one of these preachers, you need to be deeply skilled, strong with public speech. You need to be highly gifted. You need to be commanding. You need to be impressive financially, and you need to throw your weight around. You need to be honorable and strong and superior. And Paul writes a whole letter to the people of this city saying, actually, here's how I'm going to present myself to you. Here are my credentials. I'm desperate. I have been brought to places of such despair that I despaired of my life. You don't say that in the ancient world. Maybe you can say that today on daytime television, and you can get a little round of applause. Not so much in ancient Corinth. Because this is a pre-Christian world where people are not impressed with weakness, and yet Paul understood more than anyone, it seemed, that God was going to get his work done through weak people who are not impressive. And if you were impressive, God's method, God's plan with you was to bring you to a place of deep despair in yourself, just as he says in these very verses here. This we felt was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. God's plan for your life is to bring you to a point, perhaps frequently, where you don't rely on yourself, where you see, I have not got it. I am not the answer, and I haven't got the answer, and I'm desperate. I'm desperate. Here's the thing. How do you interpret those times? How do you handle it when you come to that point of seeing that you're desperate, seeing that you're nothing, seeing that you failed? Because if you misinterpret it, it becomes persuasive evidence that you need to end things. Because there's a liar, there's a deceiver, there's a father of lies who takes these little pieces of information and brutally assaults you with them. But then there's another master. He says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, all who can't do it, all who are at the end of their tether. Come to me, all who are poor in spirit. Come to me. I'll give you rest. What's the qualification? You can't do it. What's the qualification? Failure. What's the qualification? Weakness. What's the qualification? Despair. You think your despair is a reason you can't come to God? I tell you, it's the direct opposite. You are in the best place to come to God. You've got a head start. If you come to a place of failure, you come to a place of deep despair, this is the time where you turn to Jesus. It's the time where you meet him. He's good in the pit of despair. He spends a lot of time there. It's where he goes looking for people. That's what he did for us. And suicide is when we choose to die. We choose to throw away the life that God gave us. And there's one person that didn't even have to choose to live. He did choose to live. We find ourselves living. Jesus chose to live in order to die. And such a death. Jesus came to a point of total abandonment. Talk about being cut off. The Bible says he was cut off from the land of the living. Jesus tasted utter despair. Jesus was utterly abandoned. Jesus was cut off, rejected by people, and on the cross, rejected by his Father. Heaven and earth despised him. He was utterly despairing on the cross. Why, my God, have you forsaken me? He said. Jesus knows about despair. Jesus carried it. Your feeling of deep despair, your feeling of failure, your feeling of shame, your feeling of having to face things coming upon you, and you don't know how you're possibly going to face them. Jesus took it all, and he took it to the end. He took it into the grave. He cried out in despair. He did it for us. He did it so the person who's so sure that they're disqualified, they're so convinced, they're so persuaded that there'd never be a place in God's house for them. There'd never be a moment's concern in the heart of God for them. That person who's so completely certain can have the almost unbelievable and surprising, stunning discovery that the whole point of God's plan through history, all that God planned, all that he put in place from the moment he said, let there be light, he was planning it from before the creation of the world, that he would come into this world as a man, that he would take on our curse, he would take on himself all the shame, all the despair, all the horror, all the worst things about us. He would take it on himself, and in return, he would give us hope, such hope. And so we can look at him as the one who's risen from the dead, literally, physically on the third day. And as Paul says, knowing this, we don't put our hope in ourselves. Our hope is the one who delivered us from such a deadly peril. He will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. If he rose from the dead, friends, we can put our hope in him because he's involved. He's in it with us. He's in this life. He is involved in tomorrow. He's involved in the day after. He's very involved. We've put our hope in him. He will deliver us again and again, says Paul, at the bleakest point of despair. I invite you to do the same. Let's pray. Father, as we come to communion, we confess that these issues are too big for us to deal with in our own strength. We need the Holy Spirit's help. And I pray for every man or woman hearing these words, that they would be set free by the wonder of the gospel of Jesus and given back great measures of hope in Jesus' name. Amen.